Is now 10:50 hours on 26 December 2000. Interview of Mr. Howard Borden, conducted at the Latham headquarters. Interviewer is Lieutenant Colonel Robert von Hassel. Mr. Borden, tell me about your early life, where you were born and raised.
I was born in Albany. We moved to Schenectady when I was really small, and then we moved to Guilderland. That's halfway between Albany and Schenectady when I was, I believe, 8. So then I started the apprentice course at GE in Schenectady, and that's when I got drafted and went into the Army.
And what year was that?
That was in 52. And I served 2 years until 54. But I went to Korea in 53, so I was there for the last 4 months of the war. I keep kidding my son that I had to go over and end the war. But I joined the 3rd Division in Korea, and I have some notes. And it was interesting. My grandfather was a train engineer, and he would have loved to see the train that we went from Busan up to above Seoul. It was a narrow gauge train, one track, and every time a train came the other way, we had to pull off and let the train by. And we were greatly impressed because most of the trains that were headed south had wrecked vehicles on them. I mean, wrecked, shot up, and blown up and everything. Tanks, trucks, jeeps, the whole works. And we were pulled off on a siding, and we would see these trains go by and wonder, what's going on here? This does not look good. So we got up a little bit further north and got into our outfits, and it was nighttime, but you had a daylight out. And they had all these searchlights in the back off the clouds, and they called them moonbeams. And it's better than the moonlight. And it lit up everything. There were shadows and everything, but you could see what's going on. Anybody moved, you could see. And this impressed me, because I've seen it in a couple of films or movies. The one on Pork Chop Hill, they turned on the lights when they shouldn't have, and they illuminated all the GIs. So that impressed me quite a bit, was these moonlights. So I ended up on the front line. I ended up in a communications section. We were in the headquarters company of a 1st Battalion, 15th Regiment. There was an old-time sergeant there from World War II, retread. He came up to me one day and he says, "Do you want to see an airstrike?" So I said, "Sure, why not?" So we go up on a hill, we watch an airstrike, because everything was trench warfare then, when I got to Korea. So I didn't give another thought. We just went up on a hill, we watched the airstrike, and that was it. So a couple days later, he comes up to me at a different time, and he said, "Do you want to see an airstrike today at 3 o'clock?" So I'm saying, how does a sergeant in the Army know that there's going to be an airstrike, at a certain time? Well, we had panels that you put out in front of the trenches, different colors, different directions. Every day you had to change the panel, so the flyboys would know where the lines were. So I said, "Well, how do you know there's going to be an airstrike today?" So he said, "Never mind, come up with me on the hill, we'll watch the airstrike." So we did. So we come back, and I kept quizzing him. How do you know, as a sergeant in the Army, that there's going to be an airstrike at a certain time? He says, "I get a telegram every time. Make sure your air panels are correct at 3 o'clock, or whatever time the airstrike is." So he said, it didn't take me long to figure it out. That's what's going to happen. So we go up, and the second time we watched an airstrike, the plane got shot down. And the pilot parachuted in no man's land. So our commander was smart enough, he calls back to artillery, "Get some smoke out there." Smoke up the no man's land, and he sent a tank destroyer out. And the pilot came back. We got him. Our guys got him. Tank picked him up with one of these tank destroyers. It's like a tank, but it has no turret. It's all hollow inside. Picked him up, brought him back. He had broken either his arm or shoulder. We couldn't tell. But he had his arm in a sling, but you should see the smile on the guy's face. Because they took him into our aid station for maybe 5 minutes, checked him out, and then they got him out of there. Because they knew the Chinese would be, in fact, they were probably out in no man's land looking for him too. And they got him out of there, and sure enough, right after he left, we started getting artillery in. Everybody goes in their bunker and behind the hill. And the funny thing, next to us were some Greeks. And like I said, whenever we get artillery, we'd go in our bunker. And then when the artillery stopped, we'd go in the trenches. And usually by then the Chinese were there. But the Greeks, whenever they get artillery, they'd go forward. And when the Chinese would come up the hill to attack them, they're ready for them. They're waiting for them. So let's see about my notes. Okay, they moved us to a different area, and there was 3 hills, Tom, Dick, and Harry. And they had a big fight in June of the year the war ended of O.P. Harry, because they sent our Charlie company out on the hill, and they got surrounded. In fact, they got pretty well decimated because we were in communication, so we knew what was going on. We could tell. In fact, we were next. They were going to send us out to the hill to relieve them, but it didn't happen. We got a call from way back. Some general called and said he had a sound power telephone in some command bunker on the hill. And he said the commander of Charlie Company was wounded and in his bunker, but he was on the sound power directly to the general. And he had communications that, that they were all right, but the commander was wounded. So, and that was in June, and the war ended in July. And that's when we went up to, we were in relief, or we were in reserve, and we went up to relieve triple nickel, 555 artillery that had been overrun by the Chinese. And that's when I saw Major John Eisenhower. He was on the road directing traffic, getting the right unit in the right place. And that's why I was very impressed that he was still there. His father was president. I thought, they'd pull him right out of there, out of Korea, but they didn't. He was right there. He was right on the front lines. And he was directing traffic, because we looked out and they said, some major is directing traffic. There's an MP up on the road. So I look out, Eisenhower on his jacket. And I looked, had the oak leaf cluster, Major John Eisenhower. And that's the last I saw him, because the war ended right after that. Mm-hmm. Because, well, we lost some replacements. We went into an area that the triple nickel had as an artillery unit, and the Chinese had overrun it. And what we were in was the rear area of the artillery unit, and they still had some tents there, some squad tents. And when we started getting shelled, we'd go into bunkers. We'd been there a while. We knew smart enough to get out of the way. Well, these rookies, just replacements, just got there, 7 of them. They went in a squad tent. We went out the next morning with daylight, and here's a squad tent, all riddled with shrapnel holes. We go inside, 7 guys are gone. They're dead. Which, somebody should have told them that you don't go in a squad tent when you're getting shelled, because that canvas is not going to help anything. Get in something, get in a bunker, get in behind some sandbags, or something better than a tent. So we had one of the other replacements. The war was announced that the war was ending. This was 10 in the morning, and it was a 12-hour period before everything happened. Well, everybody headed for a bunker. They did not want to be the last guy wounded or killed. We had a replacement that got there. He wanted to give himself up to the Chinese. And we said, I don't get your thinking. He says, well, I'm going to be repatriated. I'm going to be a prisoner of war, and then he'd be switched, because they'd already had Operation Little Switch, and then they had Big Switch after that. It was his thinking that he would be a prisoner of war for a few days, and then the Chinese would give him back, and then he'd go back to the States. So we said, no, no, we know that, and you know that, but the Chinese don't know that. They weren't the greatest for the Geneva Convention. They were well, some of the Germans we heard in Normandy tied prisoners up to Malmedy. They shot some prisoners. Well, the Chinese weren't much better. So we had to tie the guy up and turn him over to the MPs, after the war was over, the next day. And some lieutenant came around and said, "What's going on? How come this man is tied up?" So we told him what happened. He says, "You did the right thing." And they took him out of there, and we never saw him again. But he probably got a Section 8. But it was ironic, the way it happened, because we kept saying, we know that, and you know that, but the Chinese don't know that. And I said, besides, you don't know what's out there. You walk through a minefield, you don't know what you're getting yourself into. But he was going to do that. So, and the MPs came and took him away, and then the next day, we looked through the artillery BC scope, and here's all the Chinese, all dressed in white. During the war, they weren't dressed in white. They had camouflage or padded stuff on. But they were all dressed in white, and they're taking apart the 5.55's artillery pieces and taking them back. So that's what we had. And so then, from then on, I was there another year, and mostly in reserve. A lot of red alerts, a lot of field problems, but we had a radio truck that had a special antenna on it. So we always put the radio truck on top of a hill so you could reach out. A lot of hills there. And you get down in a gully, you don't reach anybody. So when we come back from a field problem, it was always a problem with a radio truck because it was so far away. He was always last. So we get back from a field problem and radio truck is not there. Well, that's not unusual. So about 2 hours later, this guy comes in. "Harry, where have you been?" "Don't want to talk about it." Uh-oh, he got into trouble somewhere. So we said, "Harry, what happened? We know you were late because you were remote from us, but you didn't come back with us, or usually it's 15, 20 minutes. And he was 2 to 3 hours late. He got lost. He says, "Here I was going down a superhighway in the middle of Korea." We said, "Wait a minute, there are no superhighways in the middle of Korea." He was on a forward airstrip. It was one of these emergency airstrips. How he got on it, we don't know. And he says an AP came out and stopped him and gave him the devil for being there. Said, "You're on a forward airstrip, get off." And he says, "Hey, Mac, have you seen a convoy go by here?" It must have blown the guy's AP's mind, because he just said, "There's the exit, out, get out." So he did, he left, he came back and saw us. So that's about all I had, and you have some questions, I'm sure.
Well, tell me what happened after the war. You spent an additional year in Korea?
Yep.
And then you came back to New York?
Correct.
Well, how was your life after that?
Good, yeah.
What did you do?
Well, I got discharged.
Mm-hmm.
I went back to work in Schenectady and GE and finished my apprentice course. That's what happened there.
And subsequent to that, what did you do for employment? Did you get married, have kids?
Oh, yes. Yeah, we got married, I think it was a year after I got home. I graduated from the apprentice course, got married. Then we moved out with GE, had 2 kids, a boy and a girl. So got laid off from GE 9 times. So last time I left and went to IBM in Kingston. Mm-hmm. So I retired from IBM in Kingston 8 years ago and moved back to Albany. So because that's where most of our family is, up here in this area. So
after you were drafted, where did you do your basic training?
At Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania. It's a Pennsylvania National Guard camp, and we were like second cousins, because whenever the National Guard had to do anything, they had first preference, and we we didn't, because our basic training cycle was 16 weeks, and I had 17 weeks, and everybody said, how come you had an extra week? Because the week we were supposed to go on bivouac, the National Guard was going to go on bivouac. That was their 2 weeks there. So we had an overlap. So we had an extra week of basic training, and then we went on bivouac after that.
And when did you find out you were going to Korea?
Well, it was a long story. Had two choices not to go to Korea. One of them was the married men they were sending to Germany. The single men they were sending to Korea. So there was a cadre school at Indiantown Gap or the paratroopers in Fort Benning. And I don't know why, I just have that feeling there's no reason I should jump out of a good airplane. So I said, I'm not going to be a paratrooper. So I went to the cadre school at Indiantown Gap. We went there and saw some of the people that were there. They said, oh, that's not bad, you know. Besides, you learn more. And I did. I fired the M1 more in this school than I did in basic training. And in fact, later on, we were acting cadre in another basic training outfit, you know, as part of the school. And we found out we could fire when they go on the firing line and they'd fire, and they'd always have the alibis fire. We could take the M1s, and we had all the ammo. We could fire the M1, and that's when I fired it more than I did in basic training. And the funny thing was, we had a bunch of people from Chicago area there, and they are strange, but different. And one of the fellas was an alibi, and he was firing on a certain target. So we took rifles on both sides of them, 3 or 4 deep, and we all fired at the same target, same guy's target. Because we got a call from the pits. You know, they said, you know, did he hit the target? He's only supposed to have 9 shots in the target, and he's got, you know, 37 or something. What's he got, a machine gun up there? So we didn't want to say what was going on, but that's what we did. We fired the M1 more there than we did in basic training.
Did you feel like this training prepared you for what you eventually faced in Korea?
The basic training didn't, but we got a lot from the cadre school, because they had quite a bit on what to do if you're a prisoner. We learned more, I think, in 6 weeks there that we needed in Korea than we did in basic training. I mean, we got the basics in basic training, but you got a lot of extras, and they told you, you know, if you're captured, your best thing is to, you know, name, rank, and serial number. Or if you do go beyond that, you're just a peasant. You know, you're not anybody high class. You're just a peasant. And to try and escape as soon as you could, because you're in better shape, and the guy guarding you is not a trained prisoner guard. You know, he's another infantryman. So they said, if you're going to escape, your best time to escape is early. You know, as soon as you can, not later on, because they're going to take you far away, and then you've got a long way to go to hit the lines.
So how did you actually get to Korea?
Took a train from Albany to Chicago, and then from Chicago to Seattle. And then we took a ship from Seattle to Yokohama, got off the ship, got our gear, got right back on the same ship like 2 days later, and went to Busan. So, because the funny thing was, I was in the Army, and I've got 31 days on a ship. My brother was in the Navy. He's got 1 night on a ship. So he takes a lot of heat on that.
So once you got to Busan, they shipped you north.
Yep, on a train.
And where exactly were you?
We were above Seoul, in the Chorwan Valley.
Mm-hmm.
Because when I saw Seoul, it was a tent city. It was decimated. Seoul was leveled, and there were just tents there. And I've talked to some people that had been to Korea recently, and they said, Seoul's all built up. It's a big city, modern city. Because my daughter married a fellow who was in the Army, and he was at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, and we went out there to visit her a couple of years ago. And one of the guys had that lived near them had just come back from Korea. And my daughter had told him that, gee, my father was in Korea when the war was on. He said, I want to talk to him when he comes here. So we got there, and I couldn't get out of this guy's sight. He wanted to know, how was it there when the war was on? And I said, well, we didn't see any civilians, because we were north of that, pretty much. And he was on the DMZ in occupation, and he said they didn't see many civilians either, but he said they saw a lot of North Koreans, through binoculars. So, but the funny thing was I only saw one Thompson submachine gun when I was in Korea, and it was a master sergeant. It was the first sergeant of Charlie Company in our battalion. I never saw him use it, only once. And that's when Sigmund Rhee let all the prisoners loose. I don't know what, there was something going on there with, Sigmund Rhee was older and he was quite political. And I think MacArthur was gone then, and Ridgway was in command. And Sigmund Rhee cleared out the prisons, Chinese and North Koreans. Well, we knew they were going to go home. We knew they were going to go north. Well, this sergeant stood out on the road with his Thompson, and he could speak some Korean. And he told them, you can go home, but leave your weapons here. And some would and some wouldn't. Well, he had some pile of people piled up in front of him, and that's the only time I saw a Thompson in use. Nobody else had any. We had the M1s, and then we had the carbines that most people had reworked that would fire automatically, and they had the clips taped on. It was a 30-round clip, but they had two taped, one on each side. So as soon as one emptied, they could turn them around and push them in. So they had 90 rounds they could fire with it. And that was a good, machine gun type weapon that was handheld. Because the AR was good, but it was pretty heavy. So,
Now, you were basically in a static position.
yes, we were. Yep.
What was your typical day like up on the line?
Well, during the day, you didn't move around much because you didn't want to be seen. That was the thing. And at night, we did most of our things at night because a lot of patrols at night. Because here was a mile or more of no man's land. We were on one hill, and the Chinese were on the next hill, which was 2 miles away, roughly. And everything in between was no man's land. And we'd send patrols out, they'd send patrols out. Sometimes we'd meet, sometimes we wouldn't. So.
Did you ever go out on a patrol as a headquarters
yes.
company member?
Yeah.
Tell me about it.
It's different, and it's quiet. You took nothing with you. You left your change. You had to tape your dog tags up, so you're quiet as possible. And it was a small patrol, 5 men usually. And what they did, they'd send a patrol out, and we'd have a radio. And then they'd have a bigger group that you could call if you got into trouble. Fortunately, we never did. So, but it was ironic. When I got back to the States, I go back to GE, and I had top secret clearance when I left. And that helped me get into communications when I was overseas, because I already had clearance. But we come back, go through the clearance again, and they hand me a piece of paper, blank, the form, and they say, well, here's the form. They pull out a file, here's your old form, copy it over and add 2 years U.S. Army, and we'll get you your clearance back. So I said, that's okay, but anybody could do that. And the guy says, well, that's all right, you were fingerprinted. I says, I was originally, but I wasn't when I came back. Well, he wouldn't let me out of his sight. He says, you will be fingerprinted. He says, come with me. Went down to the fingerprint. So we got talking, and he was in the 3rd Division. He was in the same division I was in. And when he was in G2, he was in intelligence. And he's telling me some of the things that went on that I didn't know about, and then some of the things I got talking with him, he says, you shouldn't know about that. So I got telling him about one night after a patrol had come back, and they brought some Chinese back with them. They were dead. And they had them laying out in our place until Graves registration came up and picked them up. So I said, what are they going to do with these guys? Going to clean them up, put fresh uniforms on, take them back out, and leave them out there. And then they tell the Chinese to come and pick them up. And I said, well, I don't get the reasoning on that. You know, I said, I wouldn't like that if one of my buddies got killed. And then, you know, they'd left them out there. I said, I'd kind of wonder, maybe they got them, you know, maybe something happened. But that's the way they did things. Well, we got hot chow every morning, and one of the cooks came up, and he saw the bodies there. Well, he goes in his Jeep, and he gets a camera, and he takes pictures of these bodies laying on the ground. Yeah, we didn't think anything of it. Well, you couldn't get any pictures developed in Korea, but whenever somebody go on R&R to Japan, they take the films back with them. So whenever you went, you always had 4 or 5 things of film to be developed. That was, when you first got there, that's you dropped off the film, and when you came back, you picked them up, brought them back. Well, these pictures never came back. They were in Japan. Somebody got them in the film developing. We saw them a couple months later in a magazine. It was Pick, or it was like Life, but it wasn't Life. It was Pick or some other magazine that's not printed anymore. And here's those pictures of the Chinese bodies laying there, atrocities committed by the American GIs. And I said, wait a minute, I saw those pictures being taken. I know better than that. Well, I was telling this guy from the 3rd Division. He says, you'd be a good one as an anti-communist, how some of their propaganda or some of their printed stuff is lies. I said, well, boy, that was an out-and-out lie. You know, here's a picture and it says atrocities committed by the Americans. I said, I know better than that. They weren't, you know. I said, I didn't agree on some of the things they did, but cleaning them up and putting a fresh uniform on and putting them back out for the Chinese. I said, but, you know, they were killed in the war. They were killed in a firefight. You know, nothing, no atrocities intended. But, you know, the way it came out in the article, that's some of the lies that the communists told. He said, well, you're a good one. He said, anti-communist. I said, well, that's the way it goes.
Did you, were you subjected to any other communist propaganda while you were over there?
Just the loudspeakers. We heard the loudspeakers, and that was kind of eerie.
Tell me about it.
Well, they would play music, and then some guy would come on and, you know, give yourself up type thing, you know. You're better off on our side and all this. And everybody said, you know, that's a lot of baloney, you know.
While you were in the line, were your positions ever attacked by the Chinese?
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah.
What was that like?
Different. Artillery is worse than small arms fire, because artillery you can't retaliate against. So, and that's the worst thing. And at one time we were moving, and when the line wasn't quite static, and we had set up kind of temporary, and here comes artillery down a road, and somebody was walking it in, somebody was calling it in, and it got right next to us and started walking right over into our area. And you knew somebody was up in the hills calling that artillery in, and there's nothing you can do about it. All you did was scatter. And we had no bunkers, we had no trenches, we had nothing, you know, because we had just moved into that area. So everybody just scattered.
What about ground attacks? You know, did the Chinese try to come up and infiltrate at night, or?
No, but I heard about that, because the fellow that I had met back here said that one of the American officers somewhere along the line either had been captured or had given himself up. We don't know which. But he said he turned and he'd come back and he'd course, we couldn't tell a Chinese from a North Korean, from a South Korean, from a Japanese. We couldn't tell. So he said, he came back in his full uniform, and he had people with him, Oriental people. Well, they were Chinese or North Korean, we don't know which. But they'd come in, and they'd wipe out a bunker. And every once in a while, they'd come around, and here's a bunker. Everybody's dead. They couldn't figure out why. Well, finally, one day, one of the guys lived, and he said he was led by an American lieutenant. Well, then they started, this guy in G2 started putting things together, and they figured out who it was and why, and of course then they got the word out. So they did a lot of infiltrating at night, but not in our area, luckily. We had too much stuff out there, barbed wire and mines and everything else. So you could tell when they were getting close. So.
How did you feel about being up on the line while the peace talks were going on in Panmunjom?
It was different. It was different. Because every day you were hoping that they'd have the peace, and finally they did. But you know, I guess that went on for like 2 years, the peace talks.
You ever worry about getting shot while peace was being concluded?
Oh yeah, that's why when they finally announced the armistice and it was going to go on for 12 hours, everybody went underground. Everybody went in a bunker. And except the rookies, they didn't know any better, because our side and the Chinese unloaded everything, got rid of all the artillery and all the mortar shells and all the ammunition. For those 12 hours, it was probably the worst bombardment we'd ever been in, but we were in a bunker, you know, with 3 or 4 feet of sandbags over your head and logs, so we were pretty safe. Because nobody wanted to be the last guy shot or the last guy killed in the war. So.
What was it like right after the armistice went into effect?
Well, we went back into belated training. All kinds. Infantry basic training, and you know, we had to teach some communication skills, you know, radio, switchboard, wire playing and all that. Because it was funny, because it was a static position, they had a lot of telephones, but whenever you get artillery, they'd blow up all the lines, so we'd have to replace the lines. So radio was the best communication. The only problem was the Chinese could listen in, and it was funny, we'd have what we call a commo check every hour, but you know, they did it right on the hour. Every once in a while, you get a Chinese guy on there, commo checky, and you say, hey, that isn't, because we got, so we knew who you're talking to from the sound of their voice or their accent or whatever, and you're saying, that's not Charlie, or that's not George, or that's not Sam, that's probably a Chinese who couldn't speak English that well. But some of the Chinese spoke very good English. In fact, some of them were college trained in the States and went back to China. So.
After the armistice, was life on in the trenches a little more relaxed, or were you still?
Oh, a lot more relaxed. Of course, we weren't in the trenches. They pulled us back into reserve, and that's when we lived in tents. And we were 5 or 10 miles behind the lines, but it was a lot more relaxed.
Did you get a chance to go on any R&R in Korea and Japan?
Once. I went to Japan once. This was after the war. Because toward the end of the war, they cut out R&R for a while, and then they started it up again. So I went to Kobe, Japan, for R&R. And I think it was 5 days, but then they couldn't get a plane to take us back to Korea, so they extended us a couple of days. The only problem was everybody was out of money by then, so you didn't go too far from the R&R center. You know, you couldn't go back into town and go in the hotel, because that was the first thing we did. You went to a hotel and got a good meal, because when I finally did leave Korea, we got on a Navy ship to come back to the West Coast, and we ate with a Navy crew, and they had bread and they had ice cream and they had quite a few things, and they were complaining about it, and we said, we haven't seen any of that for a year. What are you guys complaining about, you know? Says, we got no fresh bread. Everything was canned or frozen, and it was used one meal because they had no refrigeration. So they'd open a can and we'd eat it, and the rest got thrown out. So
Did you ever get a chance or an opportunity to relate to any of the Korean civilians?
not the civilians, but some of the ROK soldiers. Some were good, some weren't. We had a sergeant in our outfit that was South Korean, and he'd been around quite a while. And he could speak Japanese, because what they did, we had what they called katusas. It was the South Korean CCC, so to speak. They were too old to be in the army, but they used them as laborers, and they were good, because they dug trenches and they carried things around. But when we talked to them in English, they'd say, you know, no comprende type thing. Well, we'd call for Sergeant Tanaka. He'd come and he'd talk to them in Japanese, because they knew when somebody said something in Japanese, they did it, or the next thing was a sword somewhere. So he'd come and yak at him in Japanese, and then he'd ask us what did we want done, and we'd tell him, and he'd tell them in Japanese, and they did it, because they knew they had to do it or else. But if we talked to them in English, they couldn't understand. We know they did, but they didn't choose to understand.
When you got back to the United States after the war, did you feel like neglected by the public, or?
Well, only once. And it was funny. That's when I said I know how the Vietnam vets felt. Because we came back, we landed in Seattle on a ship, and they had a band playing and, you know, people on the dock, and it was wonderful. But then we got on a plane. Well, we complained that we had to go to Fort Lewis because we were from the East Coast. And all the guys from California got off the ship and got on a train right away, and they headed home. And they sent us to Fort Lewis. And we said, well, if we don't like that, you know, why are we going to Fort Lewis? Why aren't we getting on a train right away? Because you guys are flying out tomorrow. Ah, that made it a lot better. So we got on a plane, and we landed in Milwaukee, and of course they had to fuel the plane, and we go in the airport for lunch. And of course we had our uniforms on and all our medals and all that. We were all decked out and bought some magazines. And we got to the counter, and one of the guys was at the counter, and some old woman asked him, gee, you're all decked out in uniform. Just got back from Korea, ma'am. So she looked at him, she said, oh, do we still have troops over there? Well, we thought he was going to kill her. We said, we better get him out of here. So let's go back to the plane. So we did. So I know how the Vietnam veterans feel. That was the only time that anything ever happened, you know, because everything else was good. You know, we got to Camp Kilmer and then got discharged right away. And fortunately, being Borden, I was always in the first roster, so you know, I'd get processed right away. Well, some of the guys that had their names Z, they got stuck with details, but I was always in the first roster, so I got out right away, and then I went right home. So everybody was well received, you know, you're back from Korea, you know, okay, it was good.
Well, I think we're about running down on time. Howard, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think I've covered all my notes and most of your questions.
Good. Well, thank you very much.
Okay, yeah.